Lincoln, Nebraska. Spring 1938. Frank Keller learned about deception in a high school auditorium that smelled of sawdust and cheap paint. At 16, he was the stage manager for Lincoln High's production of Hamlet, responsible for making audiences believe that a gym teacher was a Danish prince and that plywood battlements were ancient stone. The magic wasn't in the materials. It was in the details that sold the illusion. People see what they expect to see, Mr. Harriman, the drama teacher, explained while Frank positioned a prop sword to catch the stage lights. Your job isn't to create reality, it's to create convincing unreality. The difference between good stagecraft and great stagecraft is in the small details that the audience never consciously notices but subconsciously accepts. Frank absorbed the lesson like gospel. He spent hours studying how shadows created depth, how strategic damage made new props look ancient, and how careful positioning could hide stagehands in plain sight. While other boys his age were learning to throw fastballs or rebuild carburetors, Frank Keller was learning the architecture of belief, how to make people trust their eyes even when their eyes were lying to them. His father, a railroad engineer who valued concrete things like schedules and steel, tolerated the theater obsession with bemused resignation. "Not sure what you're going to do with all this make-believe, son," Robert Keller said, watching Frank paint realistic rust onto a perfectly functional prop cannon. "Can't exactly get a job pretending things are what they're not." "Sure you can," Frank replied, adding weathering to the cannon's touch hole. "That's what advertising is. That's what half of politics is. Making people believe the story you're telling." What neither of them knew in 1938 was that the skill of constructive deception, of making unreality convincing enough to stake lives on, would become more valuable than any amount of mechanical aptitude or raw courage. Frank graduated in 1940 with a theater scholarship to the University of Nebraska. He lasted 3 semesters before Pearl Harbor rendered college frivolous. He enlisted in January 1942, expecting to be assigned to engineering or logistics based on his test scores. Instead, the Army looked at his spatial reasoning abilities and assigned him to armored forces. "Tanks," his recruiter said, stamping the orders. "You'll learn to operate and maintain the M4 Sherman medium tank. It's good duty. Armor beats infantry any day." Frank didn't know anything about tanks, didn't know that Shermans were outgunned by German armor, didn't know that American doctrine prioritized quantity over quality, didn't know that tank crews had the highest casualty rates in the European theater. All he knew was that the Army had looked at his record and decided he belonged inside a 30-ton steel box. Fort Knox training transformed theater instincts into tactical applications without Frank consciously recognizing the translation. Camouflage wasn't different from stage makeup. Both used visual tricks to create false impressions. Defilade positioning wasn't different from clever staging. Both hid what you didn't want seen while emphasizing what you did. Even the concept of hull-down tactics, showing only your turret while concealing your vulnerable hull, was fundamentally theatrical. Present the strong profile, hide the weakness. His instructors noticed something unusual about Cadet Keller. He didn't just learn the manual solutions to tactical problems. He saw alternative approaches that relied on perception management rather than firepower. During a training exercise, when his platoon was tasked with defending a position against superior force, Frank positioned his training tanks among actual wrecks from the previous year's training accidents, creating confusion about which vehicles were operational. "That's irregular," his training officer noted, "but effective." "You think like a guerrilla, Keller." "I think like a stage manager, sir," Frank corrected. Same principle. Control what the audience sees, and you control what they believe. By November 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Frank Keller shipped out to England with the 7th Armored Division, carrying technical skills he'd learned in Kentucky, and theatrical instincts he'd developed in Nebraska. He had no idea that within 13 months those two skill sets would combine in a Belgian crossroads to create one of the most unconventional small unit actions of the war. He was 21 years old and still thought war was something you could understand through training manuals and doctrine. The Ardennes would teach him differently. England, March 1944. The crew of Devil's Luck came together like a theatrical ensemble cast by accident rather than design. Sergeant Tommy Vasquez, the gunner, was a former auto mechanic from El Paso who could identify vehicle types by engine sound alone. Corporal Danny Rourke, the loader, was a Boston dock worker with arms like steel cables and a nervous energy that made him talk constantly. Corporal James Chen, the bow gunner, was a quiet Californian who joined to prove his loyalty after his family was sent to internment camps. And Private William Billy Hayes, the driver, was an Alabama farm kid who could coax mechanical performance from equipment that should have been condemned. Keller inherited them when their previous tank commander died of pneumonia in the rain-soaked British training grounds. He was 21, they ranged from 19 to 26, and none of them trusted the college kid who talked about tactics like he was directing a play. "No offense, Lieutenant," Vasquez said during their first crew meeting, "but you've got zero combat time and you're explaining tank warfare using theater metaphors. That's not exactly confidence-inspiring." "Fair point," Keller acknowledged. "So let me ask you something. When you're trying to fix an engine, do you just throw parts at it randomly, or do you diagnose the problem first?" "Diagnose first, obviously. Combat's the same. You read the situation, identify the problem, apply the solution." Keller gestured at the Sherman they'd been assigned, a factory-fresh M4A1 that still smelled of cosmoline and fresh paint. "This tank is a tool, not the best tool. German armor outguns us, out-armors us, and outranges us. But tools don't win fights. People using tools creatively win fights." "So what's your creative approach?" Chen asked quietly. "How do we beat a panther that can kill us from 1,000 yards when we can't penetrate their frontal armor past 500? "We don't fight their fight," Keller replied. "We make them fight ours. We use terrain, we use deception, we use the fact that they expect us to fight conventionally. The second they think they understand what we're doing, we do something else." Rourke laughed nervously. "That's great in theory, Lieutenant, but when we're getting shot at, theory doesn't mean much. Then we practice until theory becomes instinct." What followed were 3 months of unconventional training that made Devil's Luck's crew the odd unit in Baker Company. While other crews practiced gunnery tables and formation maneuvers, Keller drilled his team on rapid displacement, camouflage techniques, and what he called theatrical tactics, using visual deception to create false impressions about their tank's position, status, or intention. He had them practice playing dead, shutting down all systems and remaining motionless while observers tried to determine if the tank was operational. He taught them to create false damage using spare parts and careful positioning. He even had them study destroyed tanks, learning what catastrophic kills looked like, so they could replicate the appearance without the reality. "This is insane," Vasquez muttered, after spending an afternoon arranging spare track links to simulate battle damage. "We're learning to make our tank look destroyed instead of learning to destroy enemy tanks." "We're learning both," Keller corrected. "But destroying enemy tanks requires getting close enough to shoot without getting killed first. Everything we're practicing is about surviving to take that shot." The training paid its first dividend during D-Day plus 30, when Baker Company pushed inland from the Normandy beachhead and encountered a German strongpoint that had already destroyed 2 American tanks. Standard doctrine said to call for artillery and wait for infantry support. Keller saw a destroyed French farm truck positioned near the German position and had an idea. "Driver, position us behind that wreck," he ordered. "Gunner, Prepare for a flanking shot. We're going to use that truck as visual cover." By positioning Devil's Luck so the destroyed truck masked their hull from the German position, Keller created the illusion of empty terrain. The German anti-tank crew never saw the Sherman until Vasquez's 75mm round destroyed their position from what appeared to be an impossible angle. "How did you see that?" the company commander asked afterward. "I didn't see it, sir. I staged it," Keller replied. "Same as blocking a scene in a theater. You position actors where the audience doesn't expect to see them." Word spread through the battalion about the lieutenant who fought like he was directing a play. Some crews thought it was genius. Others thought it was dangerous improvisation that would get people killed. Keller didn't care about opinions. He cared about results. And Devil's Luck's crew had survived 4 months of combat without a casualty, while achieving a kill ratio that exceeded division averages. Then came the Ardennes, and the war stopped being about innovation and became about pure survival. Belgium, December 17, 1944, the German offensive hit like a geological event, sudden, massive, and reshaping everything it touched. Baker Company had been in reserve status, resting in a rear area village after 3 weeks of grinding combat near Aachen. The war was supposed to be winding down. Intelligence said the Germans were finished, incapable of major operations, just waiting for the inevitable defeat. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The first indication came at 04:30 hours when artillery fire that shouldn't have existed began falling on American positions across an 80-mile front. By 100, German armor that intelligence swore wasn't there was punching through thinly held defensive lines. By noon, entire American divisions were surrounded, supply lines were cut, and the careful Allied advance had become a chaotic retreat. Baker Company received movement orders at 1400. Proceed immediately to the crossroads outside Malmedy and establish a defensive position to cover the withdrawal of the 106th Infantry Division. 5 Shermans against whatever the Germans sent down that road. "This is a delaying action," Captain Morrison briefed them. "We hold that junction for 24 hours while engineers prepare a fallback position across the Somme River. Then we withdraw." 24 hours. Keller had led Devil's Luck through worse odds. They reached the crossroads at 17:30, just as winter darkness turned the Belgian forest into a maze of shadows. The position was tactically sound. Decent fields of fire, some natural defilade, and good observation of the northern approach road. They dug in, established radio contact with Battalion, and settled in for a long, cold night. The ambush came at 08:15 the next morning. German armor appeared on the northern road without warning. 2 Panthers and a mobile anti-tank gun, moving with the confidence of an army that owned the battlefield. They opened fire from 800 yards, beyond effective Sherman range, and Baker Company died in 90 seconds of clinical violence. The first Panther's shot hit Lieutenant Morrison's tank dead center, penetrating the frontal armor and detonating the ammunition. The turret blew 20 feet into the air. The second shot killed Sergeant Williams' crew before they could traverse their gun. The third and fourth shots came from the anti-tank gun, methodically destroying the remaining Shermans with the efficiency of target practice. Devil's Luck survived only because Keller had positioned them in a shallow depression that provided defilade from the killing ground. He watched through his periscope as his company died, powerless to engage targets that were beyond his gun's effective penetration range. "We need to pull back," Vasquez said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Now, Lieutenant, before they spot us." Keller's mind raced through the tactical mathematics. Retreat meant abandoning the crossroads. Abandoning the crossroads meant the 106th Division's escape route was cut. That meant 400 men trapped in the forest with no way out. But staying meant facing German armor that had just demonstrated absolute superiority. 5-to-1 odds had become 1-to-many odds, and that one remaining Sherman couldn't hold the position conventionally. "Lieutenant!" Rourke's voice escalated. "They're going to see us!" Through the periscope, Keller watched the German column secure the crossroads, their commanders surveying the destroyed American armor with professional satisfaction. One of the Panther commanders was photographing the wrecks, documentation of another one-sided victory. And in that moment, watching an enemy photograph of what he believed were comprehensively destroyed tanks, Keller had the most dangerous idea of his life. What if one of those destroyed tanks wasn't? December 18, 1944, 1,000 hours. "You want to do what?" Vasquez stared at Keller like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Make us look dead," Keller repeated, sketching on the map. "The Germans think they've secured this sector. They photographed the destroyed tanks. That means they've documented this as a cleared area. If we can make Devil's Luck look like another casualty, they'll ignore us when they move through tomorrow." "And then what?" Chen asked quietly. "We sit here playing dead while they occupy the crossroads?" "No, we sit here playing dead until they're in the kill zone. Then we engage from ambush at point-blank range." Keller pointed at the map. "Intelligence says a major German column is using this road to move supplies forward. They'll pass right through here, believing it's secure. We'll be the last thing they expect." Rourke shook his head. "Lieutenant, that's insane. We'll be surrounded." "One tank against an entire column." "One invisible tank," Keller corrected. "One tank they believe is already destroyed. Surprise is worth 20-to-1 odds if we execute it perfectly. And if we don't execute it perfectly, then we die. Same as if we retreat and abandon 400 men to the Germans." The crew fell silent. Through the hull, they could hear German voices in the distance. Work parties stripping salvageable equipment from the destroyed Shermans, securing the crossroads, establishing the position as a waypoint for their advance. Finally, Vasquez spoke. "What do you need from us?" What followed was 18 hours of the most meticulous theatrical staging Keller had ever attempted. Working only during darkness to avoid German observation, they transformed Devil's Luck from an operational tank into a convincing corpse. First, positioning. They moved the Sherman among the genuine wrecks, choosing a spot that provided firing angles on the road while looking naturally random, not too perfect, not too staged. Just another destroyed tank in a field of destroyed tanks. Second, visual damage. Using spare track links, they created the appearance of a catastrophic penetration on the left side. Soot from the other wrecks was carefully applied to suggest fire damage. The turret was traversed to an unnatural angle that suggested crew abandonment. A tarp, artfully torn and positioned, made it look like someone had tried to cover the wreck and failed. Third, the details that sold the illusion. Billy Hayes sacrificed his jacket, positioning it half out of the driver's hatch as if he'd died trying to escape. Rourke scattered personal effects, letters, photographs, a damaged helmet, in the pattern of a crew that had evacuated quickly. Chen even staged a shovel and disturbed earth to suggest the crew had been buried nearby. "This is ghoulish," Rourke muttered, placing Lieutenant Morrison's damaged canteen near Devil's Luck's track, a detail he'd retrieved from the actual wreck at great personal risk. "This is survival," Keller replied. "Every detail matters. The Germans are professionals. They'll notice inconsistencies. Our disguise has to be perfect." The final touch was the smoke pot, positioned beneath the engine deck to create a thin stream of black exhaust that would mimic electrical fire smoldering in a destroyed tank. Hayes rigged it to cut out instantly if needed, but while burning, it completed the illusion of a vehicle that had died badly. By 0700 on December 19th, Devil's Luck looked comprehensively destroyed. Keller personally inspected every detail, walking around the tank from multiple angles, checking sight lines and visual consistency. "It's good," Vasquez admitted grudgingly. "From 50 yards, I'd believe it was dead." "We need them to believe it from 5 yards," Keller said. because that's how close they'll get. Inside the tank, they'd prepared for a siege. Rations for 3 days. Ammunition for sustained engagement. Medical supplies. Even a bucket for sanitary needs, because once the performance started, they couldn't break character until the curtain fell. "How long do we maintain the disguise?" Chen asked. "Until the main German column passes through," Keller replied. "Intelligence says it's moving tomorrow morning. We stay dead until they're in the perfect position. Then we resurrect." That night, the crew slept in shifts inside their disguised tank, listening to German voices securing the crossroads, hearing the occasional patrol walk within yards of their position. Every sound was a threat. Every footstep could be discovery. But the disguise held, and the Germans saw what they expected to see: another dead Sherman in a graveyard of American armor. At 06:30 on December 19th, Keller took his position at the commander's station and whispered into the intercom, "Showtime." 7:34 a.m., December 19th, 1944. The world contracted to a circle of vision and a mathematics of violence. Through his periscope, Keller watched the German column approach with the mechanical precision of an army that owned the battlefield. 3 Panthers led the formation, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry, then supply trucks and support vehicles. A full mechanized company, moving with the tactical confidence that came from 3 days of unbroken victory. "Steady," Keller whispered, though his crew needed no reminder. They'd been absolutely motionless for 11 minutes, watching the column approach, barely breathing. The smoke pot continued its theatrical exhaust. The disguise held. The lead Panther rolled past at 150 yards, its commander scanning forward, not checking the supposedly secured kill zone. Perfect! The second Panther approached the optimal firing position, close enough for a guaranteed kill shot, positioned where its destruction would block the column's advance and create tactical chaos. "Gunner, confirm target," Keller whispered. "Second Panther, engine deck, 190 yards, Vasquez breathed. "Perfect angle. Fire." The 75mm cannon's roar shattered the morning silence. The carefully staged wreck erupted with lethal force, the M61 armor-piercing round crossing 190 yards in less than a second. It punched through the Panther's rear armor and into the engine compartment. The German tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its deck. "Target hit," Vasquez reported, already traversing to acquire the third Panther. Mobility kill confirmed. The German column exploded into chaos. The lead Panther's commander, realizing he was being engaged from behind, attempted to reverse, exactly as Keller had predicted. The massive tank backed directly into the disabled second Panther, blocking the road completely. "Target, third Panther, side armor," Keller commanded. "Fire when ready." Rourke had already slammed another round into the breach. Vasquez tracked the third Panther as it desperately tried to traverse its turret toward the destroyed Sherman that had impossibly resurrected. The German gunner never got the shot. Vasquez fired first, the round penetrating the Panther's side armor and detonating the ammunition. The explosion was catastrophic. The third Panther's turret blew off its mounting in a geyser of orange flame. German infantry began evacuating their half-tracks in pure panic, diving into ditches, returning fire wildly in the wrong direction because they couldn't comprehend where the attack was coming from. "Driver, displacement," Keller ordered. "Reverse 20 yards, keep us in the wreck field." Hayes gunned the engine, and Devil's Luck moved backward, maintaining the visual confusion of a battlefield full of destroyed tanks. The movement created more disorientation. German infantry couldn't identify which wreck was firing because the tank kept shifting position among the legitimate casualties. "Target, half-track," Vasquez called. "High explosive, loaded. Fire." The HE round hit the half-track dead center, transforming it into shrapnel and flame. German infantry scattered, their formation breaking under fire from an impossible direction. Some ran north, back toward their lines. Others took cover behind the burning Panthers, unknowingly trapping themselves. The lead Panther, still trying to maneuver, finally cleared the wreckage and began traversing toward Devil's Luck's last known position. But Keller had already moved, and the German gunner was aiming at empty ground. "Flank shot on the lead Panther," Keller commanded. "Vasquez, can you make it?" "Barely. Angle's terrible." "Can you make it?" "Yes, sir." "Then take the shot." Vasquez fired from an angle that barely qualified as flank, the round catching the Panther's lower hull where the armor was thinnest. It wasn't a catastrophic kill, but it was enough. The German tank's track assembly shattered, immobilizing it completely. 3 Panthers disabled or destroyed in 90 seconds. The German column, which had been advancing with absolute confidence, was now a chaotic mess of burning vehicles and scattered infantry. And Devil's Luck! The destroyed Sherman that shouldn't have existed remained almost invisible among the genuine wrecks. "Cease fire," Keller ordered. "Go quiet. Resume the disguise position." Hayes maneuvered them back to their original spot. The smoke pot reactivated. The turret slewed back to its damaged angle. Within 30 seconds, Devil's Luck looked dead again. Through his periscope, Keller watched German survivors regroup in confusion. Officers shouting contradictory orders, trying to understand what had just happened. They were looking for the American tank that had ambushed them, searching the tree lines and distant positions, never considering that the threat sat among their own kills, hiding in plain sight. The deception held. For the second time in 10 minutes, the Germans saw what they expected to see, a graveyard of destroyed American armor, and missed the lethal reality concealed within it. Keller allowed himself one shallow breath of relief. The performance had worked. The crossroads remained open. The 106th Division's escape route was secured. Now they just had to survive the encore. 8:47 a.m., December 19, 1944. The smoke from burning German armor drifted across the crossroads like stage fog, obscuring the carnage while German survivors tried to comprehend what had destroyed them. Inside Devil's Luck, Keller's crew maintained absolute silence, listening to shouted commands in German, hearing salvage teams approach the destroyed Panthers, waiting to see if their disguise would hold under close scrutiny. "Lieutenant?" "They're 30 yards from us," Chen whispered, so quiet it was almost telepathic. "Work party. 6 men." Through the periscope's narrow view, Keller watched German soldiers move through the wreckage, assessing damage, checking for survivors. One man walked within 15 feet of Devil's Luck, glanced at the apparently destroyed Sherman, and moved on without a second look. The disguise held. The radio crackled to life. Battalion frequency, encrypted. Keller risked putting on the headset. "Any Baker Company elements? This is Tomahawk 6. Respond if able. Over." Keller's finger hovered over the transmit button. Responding meant radio emissions the Germans might detect. Silence meant the battalion believed Baker Company was completely destroyed. He made the calculation in 2 seconds. "Tomahawk 6. This is Baker 5, he whispered into the microphone, using minimum power. 1 vehicle operational. Crossroads secured. 3 enemy tanks destroyed. Request instructions. Over." The response took 20 seconds, an eternity when German soldiers were working 30 yards from your position. "Baker 5, confirm status. You're reporting from a position intelligence assessed as overrun. Authenticate. Over." Keller provided the authentication code and repeated his situation report. Another long pause. "Baker 5, maintain position if able. Friendly forces from 106th Division will begin withdrawal through your position at 1200 hours. Your mission is to keep that road open until withdrawal is complete. Estimate 400 personnel. Over." "Roger, Tomahawk 6, we'll keep it open. Baker 5 out." Keller killed the radio and looked at his crew. 4 faces showing various stages of exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. "We will be here for another 3.5 hours," he said quietly. "Then we escort 400 infantrymen through friendly lines." "Lieutenant, the Germans have to be sending reinforcements," Vasquez said. "They're not going to just abandon this position." "Agreed, which means we might have to do this again." Keller checked his watch. "Rourke, inventory our ammunition. Chen, watch the northern approach. Billy, I need you to keep this engine running quiet, but ready for immediate movement. Vasquez, start identifying fallback firing positions in case we need to displace quickly." The crew moved to their tasks with the efficiency of men who'd learned to trust their commander's theatrical instincts. Outside Sims, German voices continued organizing salvage operations, treating the crossroads as a temporary setback rather than an active threat zone. At 0930, a German officer arrived with a squad of engineers. Through the periscope, Keller watched them photograph the destroyed Panthers, document ammunition expenditure, and examine the tactical geometry, trying to understand how American armor had achieved such devastating ambush conditions. One engineer walked directly up to Devil's Luck, studying the apparent damage, even touching the smoke-stained hull. Keller held his breath. The entire crew froze. If the engineer looked too closely, if he noticed the too perfect positioning or the theatrical quality of the damage, the performance would end in point-blank catastrophe. The engineer made notes on a clipboard, photographed the wreck, and moved on. The disguise held. At 10:47, the Germans made their second attempt. 2 more Panthers and a company of infantry, advancing cautiously, knowing an American tank was somewhere in the sector but not knowing where. Keller watched them approach, calculating firing angles, weighing the risk of engagement against the necessity of keeping the road open. "They're being careful this time," Vasquez observed. "Infantry screening ahead, tanks in overwatch. They learned from the first ambush." "Doesn't matter," Keller replied. "They're still looking in the wrong place. They're scanning the tree lines and distant positions. They're not checking the graveyard." The German column advanced past the morning's wreckage, officers dismounting to inspect the destroyed vehicles. The lead Panther positioned itself in overwatch exactly 200 yards from Devil's Luck, its commander scanning with binoculars, searching for threats. He never looked down at the destroyed Sherman directly beneath his observation arc. At 11:53, 7 minutes before the 106th Division was scheduled to begin their withdrawal, Keller made the hardest decision of the engagement. The German position was too strong to allow friendly forces through. He'd have to break the disguise early and engage before the American infantry arrived. "Gunner, target the Overwatch Panther," he whispered. "We're going loud in 60 seconds. Make every shot count, because we won't get surprised this time." The crew prepared in silence. Chen checked the bow gun. Rourke staged ammunition for rapid reload. Hayes positioned his hands on the drive controls, ready for immediate displacement. Vasquez settled his eyes against the sight, his breathing slowing into the rhythm of professional precision. "Stand by," Keller said. In the distance, through the trees, movement. American infantry, scattered and exhausted, began to filter toward the crossroads that was supposed to be secure. "Fire," Keller commanded. For the second time that day, the dead resurrected. December 23, 1944. 7th Army Headquarters. The canvas tent that served as the tactical review board smelled of cigarette smoke and institutional coffee. First Lieutenant Frank Keller stood at attention in clean fatigues that felt wrong after 6 days of continuous combat, watching 3 colonels and a brigadier general examine after-action reports that shouldn't have existed. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Colonel Mitchell said, reading from the report. "You deliberately disguised your tank as a destroyed wreck, remained in position surrounded by enemy forces, and conducted two separate ambushes from what the Germans believed was secured territory. Yes, sir. Violating orders to withdraw. Violating tactical doctrine for armored engagement. Essentially inventing an entirely new approach to defensive operations. The mission was to keep the crossroads open, sir. I kept it open. By playing dead. General Hasbrouck looked up from the photographs. Lieutenant, this is either the most brilliant improvisation I've encountered in 30 years of military service, or the most reckless violation of doctrine I've ever seen. I'm trying to determine which. Keller said nothing. The results spoke for themselves. 400 men from the 106th Division had escaped through that crossroads. Devil's Luck had destroyed or disabled 7 German armored vehicles while sustaining 0 casualties. The German advance in that sector had been delayed by 18 critical hours. But doctrine didn't care about results when the methods violated every established protocol. The deception itself, Colonel Harrison said, examining the technical report Keller had submitted, required detailed preparation and extraordinary discipline. You maintained absolute silence for 11 hours while German forces worked within yards of your position. Yes, sir, the crew performed flawlessly. The crew followed your orders into a situation that should have gotten them killed. Harrison set down the report. Lieutenant, you understand that what you did contradicts every principle of armored warfare we teach. Tanks are offensive weapons. They maneuver, they mass, they overwhelm through concentrated fire. They don't hide. They don't play dead. They don't conduct operations while surrounded. Respectfully, sir, those principles assume rough parity with enemy armor. Sherman tanks don't have parity with Panthers. We're outgunned, outarmored, and outranged. Conventional doctrine gets our crews killed at a 3-to-1 ratio. I found a method that reversed those odds. Through deception. Through adaptation, sir, using the enemy's expectations against them. General Hasbrouck stood, walking to the map board showing the Ardennes sector. 7th Army lost nearly 800 armored vehicles in the first week of this offensive. Most destroyed in frontal engagements where German armor exploited superior firepower. Your approach, concealment and ambush from unexpected positions, achieved results that conventional tactics couldn't match. He turned back to face Keller. It's also completely unreplicable. Your background in theater gave you skills that standard tank commanders don't possess. You can't teach this in an army manual. You could teach the principles, sir. Deception as a combat multiplier. Using the enemy's assumptions against them. Concealment as an alternative to armor. The specific techniques would vary, but the underlying approach is too dependent on individual initiative, Colonel Mitchell interrupted. What happens when a less capable officer tries this and gets his crew killed because he can't execute the deception properly? What happens when we keep following doctrine that gets 3 crews killed for every enemy tank we destroy? Keller shot back, then immediately regretted the tone. The tent fell silent. Keller stood at attention, waiting for the reprimand he'd just earned. Instead, General Hasbrouck smiled slightly. You've got backbone, Lieutenant. That's good. You're going to need it. He nodded to Colonel Harrison, who opened a folder. The Army is establishing a tactical review program to study unconventional approaches that showed success during the Ardennes offensive, Harrison said. Your action has been selected as a case study. You'll work with ordnance and tactical doctrine officers to document your methodology and determine if any elements can be standardized for training. Keller blinked. Sir, I thought I was being reprimanded. You are, Hasbrouck replied. Officially, you receive a written warning for violating withdrawal orders. Unofficially, you're being assigned to help us figure out how to keep more of our tank crews alive. The war's not over, Lieutenant. We need officers willing to think differently. What about my crew, sir? Your crew receives commendations for extraordinary performance under combat conditions. And they stay with you. If we're going to study unconventional tactics, we need the people who proved they could execute them. The review board concluded with handshakes and congratulations that felt surreal after 6 days of expecting court-martial. Keller walked out of the tent into winter sunshine, still processing the conversation. Vasquez was waiting outside, smoking nervously. "Well, are we getting shot or decorated?" "Both, apparently," Keller replied. "We're being assigned to tactical development. They want to study what we did." "Can you even teach that? Making a tank look dead?" Keller thought about the 18 hours of meticulous preparation. The theatrical instincts developed over years. The crew discipline required to maintain absolute silence while surrounded by enemies. "Maybe not the specific technique," he said slowly, "but the mindset that you can survive through deception when you can't survive through firepower? Yeah, that we can teach." Fort Knox, Kentucky. June 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 6 weeks, but the lessons were just beginning to be codified. Captain Frank Keller, promoted after his transfer to the Armored Warfare Board, stood before a classroom of tank commanders who'd survived the European theater and were now training for the expected invasion of Japan. "Deception isn't just camouflage," Keller explained, gesturing at photographs of Devil's Luck in its graveyard disguise. "It's creating a complete narrative that the enemy believes. You're not just hiding, you're actively managing their perception, making them see what they expect instead of what's real." The students studied the photographs with the intense focus of men who'd watched friends die in burning tanks. They understood viscerally that conventional doctrine had failed them, that innovation meant survival. "The Ardennes action demonstrated 3 principles," Keller continued. "First, enemy expectations are a vulnerability you can exploit. Second, the best armor is not being targeted in the first place. Third, surprise from an unexpected position is worth 20-to-1 odds." A major from 3rd Armored raised his hand. "Captain, this worked once under specific conditions. How do we know it's replicable?" "We don't," Keller admitted. "That's why we're not teaching you to copy what Devil's Luck did. We're teaching you to think the way we thought, to see tactical problems as opportunities for deception rather than just firepower exchanges." The Armored Warfare Board had spent 5 months studying Keller's action and interviewing his crew, trying to extract teachable principles from what appeared to be unreplicable genius. What emerged wasn't a technique, but a framework, what they called perceptual deception in armored warfare. The doctrine acknowledged that American armor would often face superior enemy equipment. When conventional engagement meant certain defeat, commanders should consider deceptive alternatives: concealment among wreckage, false positioning, staged damage, even abandonment ruses that made operational vehicles appear destroyed. The Germans have been using similar tactics for years. Colonel Patterson, the board's director, explained during a development meeting. "Dummy tanks, false radio traffic, concealed positions. We've just never formalized it for armored forces because our doctrine emphasized offensive maneuver." "The Pacific Theater will be different," Keller noted. "Japanese armor is inferior to ours, but they're masters of concealment and ambush. Our crews need to think defensively even when they have superior equipment." The training program that emerged from this work became part of standard armor officer education, a 3-day module on unconventional armor tactics that used Keller's Ardennes action as the centerpiece case study. It taught recognition of deception opportunities, rapid camouflage techniques, and the psychological aspects of managing enemy perception. By August 1945, more than 2,000 armor officers had completed the training. Then the atomic bombs fell, Japan surrendered, and the anticipated invasion never happened. The Pacific doctrines remained theoretical, but the principles survived. They were filed in the institutional memory of the Armor School, referenced in tactical reviews, occasionally mentioned in after-action analyses. Keller's name became associated with creative thinking in armored warfare, a footnote in military history that most people never read. After the war, Keller returned to Nebraska, earned a degree in mechanical engineering on the GI Bill, and spent 30 years designing agricultural equipment. He married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war except in general terms that avoided the specific details of men dying in metal boxes. Devil's Luck was scrapped in 1946, cut apart for steel that became refrigerators and automobiles. The crew scattered across America, reuniting occasionally for holidays and anniversaries, growing old together while the war that defined them receded into history. The crossroads outside Malmedy became a memorial site. A small plaque commemorated the American armor crews who died there, listing names from Baker Company, but making no mention of the theatrical deception that saved 400 lives. History remembered the Battle of the Bulge as a story of conventional heroism, desperate stands, armored thrusts, and grinding attrition. The story of one Sherman tank that survived by playing dead disappeared into the classified files of tactical reviews that the public never saw. It would be 63 years before anyone outside military circles understood what Frank Keller had accomplished in that Belgian crossroads. Fort Benning, Georgia. November 2007, the Armor School's National Armor and Cavalry Museum occupied a modern facility that looked nothing like the muddy training grounds where Keller had learned to command tanks 64 years earlier. At 84 years old, he walked slowly through exhibits chronicling the evolution of American armored warfare from the M1917 to the M1 Abrams, leaning heavily on a cane his daughter insisted he use. He stopped in front of a display that hadn't existed the last time he'd visited. The placard read, "Deception in Armored Warfare, The Devil's Luck Action, December 1944. Inside the glass case sat a meticulously constructed diorama showing the Belgian crossroads, complete with miniature Shermans disguised among wreckage and tiny German Panthers advancing into the ambush. Beside it, photographs from the actual engagement, including one showing Devil's Luck in full graveyard disguise that Keller didn't remember being taken. "We found that in German archives," said Colonel David Morrison, the museum's director, and, coincidentally, the grandson of Baker Company's commander who died in the first ambush. Wehrmacht photographer documented the destroyed American armor. He never knew one of those wrecks was about to kill 3 Panthers. Keller stared at the photograph, showing his younger self's desperate improvisation frozen in black and white. The smoke pot, the artfully damaged tarp, the scattered personal effects, all the theatrical details that had sold the deception to an army that believed its eyes. "The Army used your action as a case study for decades," Morrison continued. "Every armor officer from 1945 to 1973 studied the Ardennes deception. It influenced doctrine on concealment, ambush tactics, and perceptual warfare. In Vietnam, several tank crews used variations of your technique to survive engagements with superior Chinese armor." "I didn't know that," Keller said quietly. "Most innovation works that way. The original innovator never sees the full ripple effect." Morrison gestured at the adjacent display, showing modern camouflage systems and active protection measures. Current armored doctrine emphasizes first-sight advantage, the principle that the tank that sees without being seen controls the engagement. That came directly from analyses of your action. You proved that invisibility beats armor when you can't match the enemy's firepower. The ceremony that afternoon was modest but meaningful. 30 people were in the museum's lecture hall, including 2 of Keller's surviving crew members, Tommy Vasquez, now 90, and Danny Rourke, 86. The Armor School's commandant presented Keller with a retrospective commendation for his contribution to armored warfare doctrine. Innovation in combat often comes from necessity, the commandant said. Captain Keller faced an impossible situation and chose creativity over doctrine. His willingness to think differently saved lives in December 1944 and influenced how the Army approaches armored warfare for the next 6 decades. When asked to speak, Keller stood slowly, looking out at an audience that included young officers who'd commanded tanks in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting urban warfare that would have been incomprehensible in 1944. "I was a theater kid who ended up in a tank," Keller said. "The Army taught me tactics, but Nebraska taught me deception. When those two things combined at that crossroads, it worked because I had a crew willing to trust something that sounded crazy." He gestured at Vasquez and Rourke. These men sat motionless for 11 hours while German soldiers walked past our position. They maintained absolute discipline while surrounded by enemies. They executed a plan that had never been attempted because they understood that sometimes survival requires breaking every rule you've been taught. A young captain raised her hand. "Sir, when you violated orders to withdraw, did you know you were making the right decision?" Keller considered the question. "No, I knew I was making the necessary decision. There's a difference. Right and wrong are absolutes. Necessary is contextual. 400 men needed that crossroads to stay open. We were the only asset that could keep it open. Everything else followed from that reality." After the ceremony, Keller stood alone in front of the Devil's Luck display, studying the miniature recreation of his desperate improvisation. The museum had captured every detail: the angled turret, the smoke damage, even the tiny figure of a coat hanging from the driver's hatch. "They got it right," Vasquez said, wheeling his chair up beside Keller. "Every detail, just like you staged it." "Strange to see your life in a museum?" Keller replied. "Makes it feel like it happened to someone else." "It did happen to someone else. We were kids, 21, 22 years old." Vasquez touched the glass gently. "Those kids did something that changed how the Army thinks about armor. That's worth remembering." The placard listed the results. 7 German armored vehicles destroyed, 400 American soldiers rescued, 0 friendly casualties, tactical deception doctrine established, estimated impact on subsequent armored warfare, immeasurable. Keller read those words and thought about the strange path from a Nebraska high school auditorium to a Belgian crossroads to this museum case, trying to capture something fundamentally uncapturable. The moment when theater became warfare and survival depended on making the enemy believe a lie. His father had been wrong all those years ago. You could make a career out of making things appear to be what they weren't. Sometimes it even saved lives. "You know what I remember most?" Rourke said, joining them at the display. "The silence. 11 hours without moving, barely breathing, listening to Germans walk past us. I've never been like that before or since." "That's the part you can't teach," Keller said. "The discipline, the trust, the willingness to commit completely to the deception even when every instinct screams to run." "Could they teach it now?" Vasquez asked. "With modern technology, simulation, all that?" Keller considered. Modern tanks had thermal imaging, computer targeting, reactive armor, technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. But the fundamental principle remained. Sometimes you survived not by being stronger, but by being smarter. "Maybe," he said finally, "if they teach the mindset instead of the technique. If they emphasize creativity over doctrine when doctrine means death. If they remember that the enemy's expectations are a vulnerability, just like thin armor or limited range." They stood together in silence. 3 old men looking at a museum display, commemorating a moment when they'd been young and terrified and brilliant out of pure necessity. The war had taken 60 million lives, reshaped civilization, and receded into history. But this small piece of it, one Sherman tank playing dead in a Belgian crossroads, had survived in the institutional memory of an army that valued innovation even when innovation violated every rule. As Keller walked out of the museum into Georgia sunshine, he thought about legacies and lessons and the strange immortality of ideas. Devil's Luck had been scrapped 70 years ago. His crew was dying of age. Even the crossroads had changed, paved over and modernized beyond recognition. But the principle survived. When you can't win by force, win by deception. When the enemy is stronger, make yourself invisible. When doctrine means death, have the courage to improvise. Someone would remember. Someone would use it. Someone facing impossible odds would think about a theater kid from Nebraska who made a tank play dead and saved 400 lives. That was legacy enough.